land acknowledgement. As noted in more detail in the opening ceremony, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the indigenous peoples of this region. On this special land, bear today a conversation with, how should I phrase it, 3 rock stars of social movements research. Welcome to our session, Power of Social Movements for Justice and Resistance to Oppression. I'm very delighted that we have on this panel 3 very distinguished speakers from the United States, from Europe, from the Global South. Beth Condiments, Jeff Goodwin, and Ligia Tavera. My name is Markus SCHULZ, and my co-chair is Benjamin TEJERINA from the University of the Basque country in the country of Spain. The way we were thinking to proceed is the following. First, each of the 3 speakers has about 20 minutes time for a presentation, and then we will have an open floor to gather some questions that can be posed to each or all the 3 of the speakers, and maybe we do 1 or 2, 3 rounds forth and back. We should have for that conversation maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, depending. So our very first speaker, we proceed in the way the speakers are listed in the program. Our very first speaker is Beth Condiments, professor of applied social psychology in the Department of Sociology at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Bert has published extensively on social psychology of protest and social movement participation. He wrote or co-wrote over 200 articles and wrote or edited, co-edited at least 24 books, including his now classic Social Psychology of Protest. Other recent books include, with Steckenborg, The Methods of Social Movements, with Nonna Meyer, The Extreme Right Activists in Europe. He edited the Handbook of Social Movements Across Disciplines, an encyclopedia with Vrije on social movements, a book on the future of social movements research. I think his work is very much characterized by analytical imagination and empirical rigor, but he is not only at the forefront of scholarship, of research. Bert has also been one of the most active members of the ISA of all times. He has served as a president of RC48, which is the Research Committee on Social Movements, Collective Behavior and Social Change, and as a vice president for membership and finance. He is the editor of Sociopedia.isa, an online database of review articles published by SAGE together with the ISA. Bert has received many honors, among which are a royal decoration for his efforts to link science and society, the Harold Laswell Award of the International Society of Political Psychology for his lifelong contribution to political psychology, and the John D. McCarthy Award from Notre Dame University for his contribution to the study of social movements and collective action. Bert is currently involved in 2 large comparative studies: the CCC project, a comparative study of street demonstrations in more than 10 different countries, initially funded by the European Science Foundation, and Pulp Art, a study of how citizens try to influence politics. His presentation is entitled, When Repression Fails. Let's welcome Beth Condiments.
Markus, thank you for the nice introduction. You always feel better after an introduction like this. Thank you also for organizing this panel and for inviting me. My 20 minutes I will use to familiarize you with a special kind of person. A citizen who is determined to take part in a demonstration about an issue that he cares for, knowing that he might be punished, that he might encounter negative sanctions. What I want to do with you is to try to understand what kind of person is this. I zoom in on that person, and I hope to be able to familiarize yourself with that person, male or female. But first, a few words on repression. I use a definition by Christian Davenport. Repression refers to actions taken by authorities against individuals that I have to read it there. That's either restrict the behavior and or beliefs of citizens through the here is a one as well. Through the imposition of negative sanctions, applying curfews, conducting mass arrests, and banning political organizations, or that physically damage or eliminate citizens through the violation of personal integrity, torture, disappearance, killing. You will see that I'm not going to talk about that serious kind of repression, a milder version, but I think that is important as well. Obviously, if we read Christian's definition, repression is aimed to increase the costs of participation in contentious politics. It aims to increase the costs, to make it more expensive, to make it more unlikely that people participate in those contentious politics. Importantly, it need not necessarily be experienced to be effective. Expected, feared, or perceived repression might have similar effects. The effect of repression often is the decline of a social movement. Yet, almost all social movement literature predicts under certain circumstances increasing rather than decreasing movement activity in response to repression. At the individual level, it materializes itself in an increase in anger, increase in indignation, which might actually motivate people to take part in political protests rather than scaring them away from it. Repression is an understudied subject, especially if we think of in terms of what repression does to individual people, to individual members, to individual participants. We do not know that much about what does repression do to individual participants. And I think that we should pay more attention to that, especially at the individual level. The one thing that we do know is if repression is framed as a legitimate act, it will demobilize people. But if it is framed as a legitimate act, it will mobilize people. Although individual responses to repression differ greatly, the strategic decision any individual who faces repression must make is either to accept it and refrain from activity or reject and resist. And I am, of course, interested in that last type of participants. What I'm going to use is some data from one study that we are involved in at this moment. It's nicknamed POLPART, Political Participation. A study in 8 different countries, 4 mature democracies, Netherlands, UK, Germany, and Switzerland, 4 new democracies, 2 post-communist, Hungary and Romania, 2 post-authoritarian, Brazil and Argentina. If people protest, if people take part in protest, it's not a random activity. They are angry about something. They are angry, they want to protest something. The assumption of our study was that for each individual, in the end of the day, there is an issue that he or she cares for so much that he or she will take action. If that is the case, then the interesting question becomes, what kind of issue and what is he going to do. So one of the questions we asked in our study is, could you choose 3 issues out of a list of 15 that you feel to be the most pressing in your country? These are the percentages. Healthcare is the most often mentioned, which in a way surprised us, but it is an important issue in almost all other research parts we did in the context of this project. For the rest of my presentation, I will concentrate on healthcare, corruption, and immigration. So what we did is, on the one hand, asking people, would you take part in a demonstration related to one of the issues you mentioned? And at another part in the questionnaire, we asked them, what do you expect repression if you would take part in a demonstration? In a yes-no manner, you can turn that into 4 different options. A person does not take part in a demonstration and does not experience any repression, so there's no need, there's no interest. The person takes part in or is inclined to take part in a demonstration, expect no repression. So in his case or her case, it will be an easy decision it's no costs or low cost. No, the person is not taking part in a demonstration and experience repression, so that is refraining from activity because of repression. And the 4th is the group we are interested in, a person who is inclined to take part in a demonstration, experience repression or expects repression. Nonetheless, he stays involved, and that's why I called him or her a stayer. It's a little bit like a cyclist who cycles against the storm and still continued to cycle. That's why I called it stayer. So what we try to understand is, who are these people? What characterizes stayers, and what drives them? 3 different concepts: grievances, political attitudes, and social embeddedness. Grievances, the issue that the person mentioned, efficacy, to what extent is it possible to have an influence on politics and emotions. Political attitudes, political cynicism and trust in political institutions. And political and social embeddedness, movement politics, participation in movement politics, and participation in party politics, and civic participation. So our interest was, of course, to find out to what extent are stayers different than others in terms of these factors. First question, you're going to get a few numbers, if you don't mind. First question is, how likely or unlikely is it that you would take part, or that a person would take part in a demonstration for the issue that he or she has chosen? The 3 issues, healthcare, corruption, immigration. It's obvious that corruption has the highest proportion of people who find it very likely that they join a demonstration. Healthcare less, and immigration is the lowest number. Repression was measured in the following way: problems at work being frowned upon by family, friends, and neighbors, police violence, and registration by intelligence agency. Maybe, like I explained, not that heavy as the repression that Christian Davenport meant, but we have to realize people do lose their jobs, people do lose their friends, people are confronted with police violence, and people may fear to be listed by intelligence agencies. So these are real threats. I turned it into a single measure, which shows the same picture again. Now, the interesting question is, of course, back to our four options. How do they vary depending on the issue people are fighting for? 9% of the people are stayers. 9% of the people who feel that immigration is the major issue in their country are stayers, which is to say that they will take part in the demonstrations if needed, but also, or despite the repression they might expect. Corruption has a much higher proportion. We will see that corruption is the major issue that is called by many people as an important issue. So the proportion of stayers in the case of corruption is the highest we found in our study, close to 25%. Healthcare, a lower percentage, 17% is among the stayers. So the issue makes a difference. That's the first conclusion that we can draw. Depending on the issue people are fighting for, the number of stayers or the proportion of stayers varies. You could also, of course, think in terms of the country. What is the impact of the country? Mature democracies, post-communist democracies, post-authoritarian democracies. This is both absolute numbers and percentages. The absolute numbers tells us how many people are actually choosing that specific issue as the most important issue. So what we see in the mature democracies, it's the largest absolute number is immigration, and that we know it's the problem in many of the Western European countries. Proportion-wise, it's a smaller proportion that is actually a stayer on this specific issue. Corruption is typically an issue in the new democracies, so post-communist democracy, post-authoritarian democracies, and healthcare is an issue that is important in both mature democracies and post-communist democracies. So we have issues as a cause of variance. Now we have countries as a cause of variance, and now we move to the individual stayer. You may remember I mentioned in relation to grievances, anger, to what extent are people affected by the issue, and efficacy. And if you look carefully at the table, you see that all the time the stayers are more angry, whether it's healthcare, corruption, or immigration. They feel affected by problems related to the issue, but they also feel more efficacious. Which means, on the one hand, in terms of grievance theory and the impact of grievances on people's behavior, it's not just grievances, it's not just efficacy, it's a combination of the two. If there's high grievances with high efficacy, you will find people in protest. Cynicism and trust. So what we see here is that systematically, stayers, whether they are related to healthcare, corruption, or immigration, systematically stayers are more cynical about politics in their country. Also, systematically, they do not trust their political institutions, except in the immigration case, and also in the corruption case, it's not that big, the difference. I will get back to that. Political participation. So stayers, what we asked people is, could you, in the last 12 months, how many times did you take part in a political activity? Could be a demonstration, could be, if it's party politics, could be some political party activity. And what we see is that stayers systematically are much higher than the non-stayers. So both in movement politics and party politics, but again, party politics, the differences are less big than in movement politics. So our stayers are people who have a history of experience in political action, primarily or more often in movement, but in movement activities than in political party activities. Civic participation, on the whole, they spend twice as much. The question was, during the last 12 months, how much did you actively involve in some social organization? And what we see here is that stayers are much more active also in civic organizations than non-stayers. Now, we have to realize that the non-stayers are people who have chosen the issue they are demonstrating for or supposed to demonstrating for. The people who have chosen that as the most important issue in their country. So it's not just general citizens, it's citizens who choose immigration, who choose corruption, who choose healthcare as an important issue, the important issue. And the difference between stayers and non-stayers is therefore a difference between people who, although they find those issues important, refrain from participation, compared to people who also find that issue important, who are decided to take part in demonstrations if needed. I also did logistic regression analysis, but I don't think I'm going to puzzle you too much with that. The most important conclusion from that is that all factors are relevant in terms of in relation to immigration. If you look at corruption, interestingly, cynicism and trust in government becomes non-significant. So I'll get back to that in the conclusions. Okay, conclusions. So obviously it is the strength of the stayers' motivation, their political and social embeddedness that makes them stay. Note, what I mentioned already, note that both stayers and non-stayers react to issues they forwarded as important. Still, stayers deviate significantly from non-stayers. Although stayers expect that they will be punished when they take part in street demonstrations, they are determined to join protest events. They feel angry, they feel personally affected by the problems related to the issue they forwarded, but they feel efficacious. That's why they protest, that's why repression fails. Political cynicism and trust in political institutions are not distinguishing features of stayers and non-stayers. Sometimes they are different, sometimes they are not. Engagement in political parties is not a distinguishing feature either. Stayers engage much more in movement politics than in party politics. And civic participation encourages stayers to engage in protest activities. Stayers are aware of the costs and risks of participation, yet they stay on. They are the hard core of political protest. They keep the protest going against the odds. My aim was to understand what drives stayers. I built a model consisting of grievances, efficacy, political attitudes, past political participation, and civic participation. Fear for repression makes some refrain from political action. Others, however, resist the repression and engage in politics nevertheless, often precisely because of the repression. Our findings show that this requires strong motivation and emotions and a supportive social political context. Thank you for your
Our next speaker is a well-known colleague, difficult to present after more than 30 years of work and research with many articles and books reading before for some of us. But the name is Jeff Goodwin, professor of sociology at the University of New York. The main interest is and has been during the almost 30 years social movements, revolution, violence, terrorism, political sociology, comparative and historical sociology and also social theory. One of the, in my personal opinion, two of the starting point of my knowledge about his works was more or less in the year 2001. Appeared one book entitled No Other Way Out, States and Revolutionary Movements, 1945-1991. And in the same year appeared one important book edited with another colleague, James Jasper, entitled Passionate Politics, Emotions and Social Movements, that make a change in the field of the analysis of social movements, incorporating one, I don't know if forget, but less analyzed dimension in the process of mobilization as the role played by the emotion. Two other important books appeared in the year 2017. One of them is at the same time a series of 4 volumes entitled Social Movements, Critical Concept in Sociology, and the other was Rethinking Social Movements, Structure, Culture, and Emotion. Related with the presentation of today, I will remember one special guest, invited guest of the journal Mobilization that appeared in the year 2012, dedicated to political violence and terrorism. And this issue of terrorism has been constantly, but that get more important in the last years. Now is working in a book that will be appear, I hope next in the next future, but and the title would be A Theory of Terrorism. The presentation of today had to be with this aspect of unrepressed dimension of mobilization in favor of social justice, or why every struggle has a left wing. Jeff?
Can I move this down? Is okay? Thank you, Benjamin, for that very generous introduction. After that, I'm really interested in what I have to say today. Anyhow, I'd like to thank you and Markus for the invitation to speak here on this distinguished panel. Very happy to be here with such prolific and interesting colleagues. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for showing up today on such a beautiful afternoon. I hope you don't regret it. The main idea that I want to present today can be put forth very simply. What I want to say is that every movement, every popular movement, begets a labor movement. Or perhaps more accurately, every movement, every popular movement, whatever else it is also a labor movement. Every movement begets class conflict, often between its members and more often between some or maybe even most of its members and capitalists and the capitalist state. Whenever you have an enduring movement of
some significant size, I want to argue today one form or another of anti-capitalism will well up within it. Now, this claims, I should say, it's probably also the case that mass movements in every patriarchal society also beget feminist movements. And it's probably also true to say that every popular movement in a racist society begets anti-racist movements. That's a subject for another talk. What I want to claim today, though, my point today, is that every popular movement in capitalist societies begets class conflict. And this claim springs from what I take to be the central insight of the so-called intersectionality perspective, which is that no individual and no group has a singular social position or status. Every individual and every group is located at the intersection of multiple social positions, including a class position. Now, I should be quite clear, in case there's any ambiguity, that I am certainly not trying to reassert any kind of class reductionist approach to social movements. Quite the contrary. Every movement, including labor movements, is about much more than class. Racism, patriarchy, and homophobia cannot be reduced to class. But by the same token, every movement, including so-called identity movements, is always also about class. Now, before I spell out this argument briefly, let me just say a word about the anti-capitalism that I think invariably develops with every mass movement. To be clear, there are two types of anti-capitalism, at least two types that we need to distinguish, and the balance between the two within any mass movement may vary considerably depending upon a number of factors which we don't really have time to explore here. But I fundamentally want to distinguish between what we might call redistributive and revolutionary anti-capitalism, which correspond to a kind of redistributive left and a revolutionary left. The terms are pretty self-explanatory. Redistributive anti-capitalism aims to redistribute resources, certainly income, some measure of power within capitalist societies, but without fundamentally challenging the capitalist order. It's akin to social democracy of the sort we're all familiar with. Revolutionary anti-capitalism is more systemic, and it seeks, at least as an ultimate aim, the overthrow, displacement, or replacement of capitalism with some other post-capitalist, socialist, anarchist, whatever, communist social order. So I'm using anti-capitalism and the left, the concept of the left in this quite broad term. Now, the argument I want to make proceeds in three steps. The first step is that most every mass movement, the first observation really is that most every mass movement in capitalist societies consists to a great extent, and usually primarily, given the class structure of capitalist societies, of working class people. There actually are very few purely middle class social movements. Almost every movement has a significant representation of working class people, every popular mass movement certainly, and most in fact consist predominantly of working class people whatever the ideological orientation of the movement may be, or whatever its concerns or ultimate aims. This is true not only of labor movements, obviously, which consist exclusively of working class people, but it's also true, for example, of democracy movements, national liberation movements, women's movements, environmental movements, queer movements, so on and so forth. The bulk, or at least a very large number, a very large proportion of the constituents of mass movements are working class. That's the initial observation. Secondly, working class people, we know, invariably find themselves in conflict with capitalists, employers, and those politicians and political regimes which represent the capitalist class, the political representatives of capital. The conflict is indelible and permanent. It may be hidden, it may be inflamed, it may be obvious, it may be not so obvious, but the conflict of interest is permanent between workers and capitalists, both at the workplace and in the larger political society. And the reasons for this, I presumably don't have to rehearse here, but the conflict is grounded in the imperative of capital accumulation that capitalists confront. The need to cut costs, produce more efficiently at every turn in order to survive in the capitalist marketplace, which entails keeping wages as low as feasible, salaries as low as feasible, the autonomy of working people as confined and limited as possible in order to maximize profits, survive, accumulate capital, etc. This imperative places capitalists and their employees in an inherently conflictual relationship. Given these first two realities, the third and final step of my argument is simply that these inherent conflicts provide a potential constituency in most every mass movement for one type or another of anti-capitalism. And they tend to generate a labor activism and class conflict. Now here let me distinguish between two types of activism, two types of labor activism that invariably arise in mass movements in capitalist societies. The first form is one of collective pressure within social movement organizations, collective pressure by working class people to have their own needs and interests taken seriously. There's typically class conflict within social movement organizations, mass social movement organizations, over the direction, the goals, the ultimate aims of the organization. And working class people invariably push social movement organizations to take their interests, their specific interests as working class people seriously. And they can put this pressure on movement organizations or on extant labor organizations, unions, political parties, so on and so forth. The second form of labor activism or class conflict that's generated by mass movements of whatever type is the formation of new organizations, new social movement organizations, in some cases new labor organizations, arising out of these mass movements, again, to represent the interests of working class people in their conflicts with capitalists, their irrepressible conflicts with capitalists and the capitalist state. So let me give you a few examples which will make perhaps more concrete what I think I'm arguing and what I think is actually a pretty simple and straightforward proposition. I'll give you some examples. I want to give you some examples from a couple social movements in the United States, which I happen to know well as someone coming from the United States, but perhaps many of you who are not North American will recognize some of the conflicts and events that I'm talking about. So the civil rights, or perhaps better put, the black freedom struggle in the United States. Let's start with that. It's often not appreciated that this struggle, which is quite often presented rather flatly as a struggle for equality before the law and the right to vote, this struggle also involved and coincided with efforts to organize African American workers to improve their material conditions. A key aspect of black oppression in the United States has always been the super exploitation of black labor, resulting in huge levels of poverty, economic marginalization, unemployment, so on and so forth. So concomitant with the struggles of groups like the NAACP and Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference were ongoing efforts to organize black workers, black working class people. One of the most famous incidents of class conflict during the height of the black freedom struggle was a sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee in early 1968. Now this particular strike and conflict has taken on some notoriety and fame because this was, of course, a strike which was strongly supported by Martin Luther King, who was assassinated in Memphis in April 1968, when he was in the city for the purpose of supporting this ongoing strike of some 1,300 sanitation workers, a strike which was ultimately successful, I should point out, and resulted in the recognition of the union. Actually, the sanitation workers belong to a public employees union known as AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which would go on to organize a great many public employees during the 1970s in particular, including a great many African Americans. The strike didn't come out of nowhere in 1968. There had been efforts to organize these workers, sanitation workers in Memphis, dating back to 1960. Not coincidentally, the year of the sit-in movement and the surge in civil rights activism. This is just one example of how the black freedom struggle encompassed class conflict and labor struggles, in addition to the perhaps better known struggles for legal rights and the vote. Now, the same year in which the Memphis strike took place, there occurred a Wildcat strike, unauthorized by the union, the automobile union in Detroit. the United Auto Workers, very famous and powerful union. But African American workers in Detroit who were quite disgruntled with their situation in the auto plants staged this Wildcat strike. Actually, at the time, a number of Polish workers struck with them. This is in May of 1968, just a couple months after the victory in Memphis and King's assassination. They struck in a Dodge factory in Detroit, Michigan. Ultimately, this culminated in the formation of a group called DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. This was a group of black workers strongly influenced by the Black Power movement of the time, as well as by Marxist and socialist groups active in the black community in Detroit. And soon, so-called revolutionary union movements, RUMs, as they were called, spread across Detroit, primarily in the automobile sector. Eventually, this led to the formation of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, a short-lived but very influential organization which tied together the various revolutionary union movements in Detroit. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers was formed in 1969, and it can be seen as the most radical manifestation of something that was happening across the country in unions, which was the formation of black caucuses or black pressure groups within extant white-dominated unions. And this occurred in a number of unions across the country. Oh, only 3 minutes. In 1972, the leaders of these caucuses, these pressure groups, came together in Chicago to form the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. I was going to talk a bit about an analogous development in the women's movement in the United States, which culminated in the formation of a similar pressure group called the Coalition of Labor Union Women, or CLU, in March of 1974. A group that has a very interesting prehistory, which unfortunately I don't have time to say much about. This group was not, in fact, so much inspired by second wave feminism, but in fact had a much deeper history in the so-called labor feminism within the US labor movement that dates back to the 1930s. There's a marvelous book which I can recommend by a historian named Dorothy Cobble called The Other Women's Movement, which is about this long history of labor feminism in the United States. And many of these women prefigured many of the demands of the second wave feminism that emerged in the 1960s. In fact, a number of these women from the United Automobile Workers, interestingly, were instrumental in the formation of the mainstream feminist organization, women's organization in the United States, the National Organization for Women, as was, of course, Betty Friedan, a very famous feminist in the United States, who many people don't realize worked in the labor movement herself, worked for a number of years as a labor journalist for the United Electrical Workers in the United States, which was one of the communist-led unions organized by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was eventually purged from the CIO during the McCarthy period. But it remained a very left and progressive union during the time that Friedan worked for it. But I'm not going to be able to say anything more about CLU or about the organization Pride at Work, which is a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender group, which is affiliated to the U.S. labor movement and a pressure group for queer issues in the labor movement. So I have to move on to my conclusions, given the time limits, and I want to leave you with just three general conclusions. I'll try to be quick, Markus. The first is simply to repeat once again the main point with which I began, which is that popular movements beget class conflict and labor activism. I think popular movements will predictably continue to metastasize in precisely this way. And also, it also needs to be underscored that this is a good thing, that improving the lives of ordinary people, which is what popular movements are all about, entails improving their material conditions vis-a-vis capitalists and their political representatives. In other words, it requires class struggle. So the emergence of labor activism out of popular movements of all sorts can only be a good thing. The second conclusion is that it's important not to essentialize social movements. No movement has a singular and fixed set of interests. No labor movement is just a labor movement. No women's movement is just a women's movement. They also entail other aspirations that arise from the multiple subject positions, the multiple social positions in which the constituents of movements find themselves. The third general conclusion is that all movements, willy-nilly, have a class politics that requires analysis. Even movements that try to suppress class conflicts within their ranks, in fact, especially movements that try to suppress class conflict, have a class politics that is essential for understanding these movements, their demands, their constituency, their tactics, so on and so forth. And so in conclusion, every movement begets class conflict, which means that it's essential for analysts of movements, whether they're activists or scholars, to understand the sources, forms, and consequences of this conflict. Analyses of movements which ignore this class conflict are incomplete and in this way, deeply flawed. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker is Ligia Tavera Fenollosa. She is a professor and top nationally ranked researcher at the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, perhaps internationally even better known by its abbreviation FLACSO in Mexico City. In addition, she also holds a chair, a catedrática in the Research Instituto de Investigaciones José María Luis Mora, also in Mexico City. She has also been teaching there at the Centro de Estudios y Docencias Económicas, at the TEC de Monterrey, at the world-famous UNAM. She is a passionate teacher. She has supervised so far, despite her young age, already over 30 master and doctoral dissertations. She was born and raised in Mexico City, but got her PhD in sociology from Yale University. She has been a fellow at the Center of U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. She is a founding member of the Red Mexicana de Estudios de los Movimientos Sociales, of the Mexican network of social movement studies, and current editor of Movimientos, Movements, the first journal in Latin America specializing in collective action, protests, social movements, and other forms of contentious politics. Ligia Tavera's research interests include collaborative collective action, social and political change. She has been among the pioneers studying internet among Mexican NGOs. Ligia is particularly interested today on the unintended consequences of social movement and is working on new ways to introduce temporality into the study of social movements. Ligia is currently engaged in research on social movements and law in Mexico, examining why social movements decide to make a counter-hegemonic use of the law. Recent publications cover issues such as the violence against women, a study of the feminicide in the north of Mexico. It covers, there are publications about an event perspective. Many of it is in Spanish, but some also available in English, about protest artifacts in the Mexican social movement sector. That is also available in English in that recent handbook by Almeida and Guerrero, where she also had published together with Hank Johnston. She's not only a researcher, social movements researcher never are inside an ivory tower, but she also is doing outreach. She's also a real public sociologist. She appears regularly on the radio in Mexico in a program called Política en Plural, which is where she comments on current political events and their implications for Mexican society. Her presentation today is entitled Fighting for Social Justice in Guerrero, Creating Alternatives to the State's Failure to Provide Security and Justice. Let's welcome Ligia Tavera.
Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this session. As a social movement scholar, thank you. As a social movement scholar, I am deeply honored to be here today with Professor KLANDERMANS and Professor Goodwin. I would also like to thank the International Sociological Association board members for choosing to organize this international meeting around the topic of power, violence, and justice. An important topic worldwide, with no doubt, but particularly relevant for Latin American studies. Crime and violence affect the lives of millions of people in Latin America. According to the UN Development Program, Latin America is the only region in the world where murder rates increased in the first decade of this century. Plenty of factors explain crime and violence in the region, but none of them is more important than pervasive weaknesses in the basic institutions of the rule of law: the police, the prosecutors, the courts, and the prisons. Trust in the criminal justice system remains low. Majorities of the population in almost every country in Latin America have little or no faith in it. Criminals act with impunity. In response to states' failures to meet their responsibility to provide people with justice and security, indigenous communities across Latin America have come up with innovative strategies for coping with crime and with creative practices of justice. Because these experiences may become important inspirations for responding to violence and injustice to indigenous communities as well as to society as a whole, I believe it is worth knowing them. My presentation today has therefore two purposes. The first is to share with you the experience of the community police force and the indigenous security and justice system of the Comunitaria, an indigenous organization in the Mexican state of Guerrero. Here we can see, I want to share some slides with you. That's the state of Guerrero I will be talking about. And that's the area within the state of Guerrero where the Comunitaria police force emerged. So that was my first purpose. The second purpose is to offer some plausible explanations for its success in empowering indigenous communities, reducing crime, building peace, and promoting justice despite situations of poverty and exclusion. Let me please begin by giving voice to some of the people we interviewed. Those of us who travel constantly to the region of Costa Chica in the Mexican state of Guerrero feel safe once we enter the community police force territory. The military checkpoints in particular scare me, but community checkpoints inspire confidence and empathy. You know that from Chacalapa to Marquelia, you can drive safely or you can travel by bus in a quiet way. It is a feeling that disappears when you enter the highway crossing through Chilpancingo and upon arriving at Coajinacuilapa, which would be the limits of the Comunitaria. The same happens on the Montaña region. When you enter the territory of the community police force, you feel calm. Once you leave it, you feel that you must not stop driving until you reach your destination. This was a social activist and a student and a member of the Red Mexicana de Estudios de los Movimientos Sociales. If I see a state police patrol, instead of feeling safe, I feel the opposite. And the same with the municipal police, especially here in San Luis Acatlán. I do not feel comfortable. I have had the opportunity to talk with several members of the community police force, and maybe they lack training, but you feel safer because these people have ethical principles. They, referring to the municipal police, do not do justice to people because they take money. Indigenous justice works well because the offender goes directly to re-education. With government law, you deposit 20,000 pesos or 25 or 30 and you are released and start to do things again. Why? Because you have money. With these words, students of the municipality of San Luis Acatlán recount some of their thoughts and emotions regarding the indigenous security and justice system established by the communities of the Montaña and Costa Chica regions of the Mexican state of Guerrero. To deal with the violence they suffered for many years and with the official justice system, which the indigenous people see as both excluding and corrupt. At the same time, they make the point that in the connection between power, corrupt legal order, and violence, the police forces play a central role. In the past 20 years, the territory covered by the Regional Coordinator of Communitarian Authorities has expanded significantly from 3 municipalities in 1995 to 30 municipalities in 2018. The municipalities, as you can see over the map there, are located in the rural regions of the Costa Chica and Montaña regions. Today, the Comunitaria has been established in communities of different ethnic origins, such as the Naasabi, Mixteco, the Mepa, Tlapaneco, Nahua, Mestizo, and Afro-Mestizo populations. Communities that have joined the comunitaria system see it as an alternative to the nil guarantees that the official justice system offers. According to data provided by the Center for Human Rights of La Montaña Tlachinolan and the Commission for the Defense of Human Rights of the state of Guerrero, the army and the judicial police are in the first place as authorities responsible for violating human rights, followed by the municipal police and the agents of the public ministry. Indigenous organizations and communities in several regions of Mexico and across Latin America are developing new alternatives to cope with violence and are building indigenous legal systems from the bottom up. Although not as widely known as other experiences like the Zapatista movement, the indigenous movement in the southeast region of the state of Guerrero represents a very successful example of how indigenous organizations and communities are dealing with violence and are constructing new proposals for indigenous justice based on their collective identity, their collective forms of social organization, and their indigenous conception of law and justice. Who are the community police force? The Policía Comunitaria was founded on October 15, 1995 in the community of Santa Cruz del Rincón in the municipality of Malinaltepec in the Montaña region of Guerrero. During an assembly attended by official community authorities from several municipalities and by representatives of 6 social organizations of the indigenous movement in Guerrero. During the first years, anyone the police arrested was delivered to the state prosecutor's office for trial. However, as several community members noted, the state authorities released those arrested almost as soon as they were turned in, on the grounds of supposed lack of evidence, but in fact, because they gave money to the authorities. In response, in 1998, just 3 years after the founding of the Community Police Force, the Regional Coordinator of Indigenous Authorities was established to prosecute those who had been arrested, and thereby avoiding handing them over to state authorities. The organization went from being a community police to becoming a complex system of security and justice. The CRI, the coordinating of indigenous authorities, later became the CRAC, Regional Coordination of Communitarian Authorities, since the community territory includes both indigenous peoples and mestizos. Communitarian justice is administered by the CRAC's regional coordinators, who are elected in an assembly every 3 years. The coordinators are obligated to follow due process, pursuing an investigation sustained by evidence and testimonies before ruling. Depending on the case, they prioritize finding agreeable settlements and seeking out reconciliation, and plenty of time is given to resolve the issues. The more serious cases that the CRAC cannot resolve are held in regional assemblies. The delivery of justice is based on the internal regulation that derives from an effort to systematize indigenous forms of conflict resolution. These forms are integrated with elements of positive law interpreted in an original way, giving life to a true autonomous legal system. The scope of the CRAC's jurisdiction is broad, since it sanctions major crimes, such as rape and homicide, as well as minor crimes, such as robberies and stealing cattle or getting drunk on the streets. Community law draws on the principles of reconciliation, community labor, moral education of prisoners, active participation and commitment of community members, and respect of human rights. Offenders processed by the indigenous legal system are re-educated through community service for a period of time, depending on the crime. The detained convicts in re-education rotate every 15 days among towns that participate in the comunitaria system. The community is responsible for feeding and watching over them. At night, convicts are kept locked in at the Casas de Justicia or Comités de Enlace. Families are free to visit them. There are gender differences between men prisoners and women prisoners. Unlike men, women do not go from one community to the other to do community labor. Instead, they go during the day to the Casa de Justicia to do house chores and not stay overnight. But there are very few cases of women prisoners. The involvement of the town elders is an important part of the re-education process. They talk with the detainees, counsel them, and try to make them think about their wrongdoings. They are set free in a public general assembly in the presence of their families, who then become responsible for their good behavior. All police officers are elected in their own communities to take on the duty for 1 year, without being paid, as an obligation. The police officers participate in local and regional patrols and in inter-community actions under orders from the regional command. There are 12 comunitaria police officers and two police coordinators per community, and 1 regional police officer per each Casa de Justicia, or community house. Regional police coordinators and comandantes take on the duty for 3 years without being paid. The police are armed with low-caliber rifles that are registered within the army, a measure that was taken when the organization was founded and that has allowed the comunitaria to avoid being harassed or disarmed by the army. Currently, there are approximately 2,000 community police officers that provide free service in communities located in 30 out of the 81 municipalities of Guerrero. Unlike the state police, the community police has to comply with what is ordered by the community or regional assembly and must always be under the command of community authorities. There are very clear internal controls. The community is the first instance that names and knows its police. The executive committee of the community police is the second instance of internal control, and the General Assembly is the third instance. The community police is never above them. The effectiveness of the system of security and community justice is undoubted. According to the ministerial authorities of the area, since its institution, the crime rate in the region has decreased by 95%. Like other indigenous and communitarian justice systems, the CRAC is not free of conflicts, and some internal fractures have indeed occurred. Resolutions that are taken are not always the more fair, and the collective dynamics also generate their problems. Gender issues have proven a great challenge. Nevertheless, it has been very successful in providing security and justice to indigenous people and mestizos alike. These experiences of indigenous organization for security and justice raise questions regarding the relationship of indigenous communities and the state, and offer the opportunity to discuss collective justice at what anthropologists like Deborah Poole and long-term analysts of the comunitaria experience like Maria Teresa Sierra have called the margins of the state. In the process of securing peace and justice, the community police force and the regional coordinator of communitarian authorities responsible for the justice system, questioned the very definition of the state in terms of Max Weber's famous formulation, that is, a centralized control over a determinate territory. How has this, nevertheless, since its origins back in the mid-90s, the crack PC has not only maintained its operation, but has greatly expanded its area of jurisdiction. How has this been possible? In contrast to other experiences of the indigenous movement in Mexico, such as the case of the Purépecha town of Cherán in the neighboring state of Michoacán, or the juntas de buen gobierno of the Zapatistas that have expelled state authorities at the municipal level and have created autonomous territories, the crack PC in Guerrero does not reject the state, nor does it aim at building an alternative society completely outside of the state. At this point, I would like to briefly discuss three aspects of the comunitaria that, in my view, account for its success. First, a self-limiting project. As recalled by one of the founders of the comunitaria, in June 1995, leaders of peasant organizations, municipal commissioners, ejido, and communal commissariats, we all decided to call an assembly. We invited the municipal presidents, the agents of the public ministry, the examining magistrates, the state attorney general, and the governor. The first meeting was held in the municipal police station of Pascala del Oro. The second meeting was held at the Arcelia Room in the city of San Luis Acatlán. The third meeting was held in a community of Santa Cruz del Rincón at the municipal police station, and it was there when the PC was formally constituted. Note that in each of these meetings, government authorities were invited, and that the assemblies were held at the municipal police station. Having the meetings at the official police station was not an act of defiance, but of recognition of state authority. Additionally, as I've said, for the first 2 years, anyone the policía arrested was delivered to the state prosecutor's office for trial. Unlike autodefensas, or self-defense groups, the crack PC does not represent an, quote-unquote, exodus from institution, and it does not attempt to change the official justice system, nor does it aim at recovering traditional indigenous government. The comunitaria is a self-limiting project whose purpose is to guarantee security and peace within indigenous territory, and not to confront the state. Okay, I think I'm running out of time. The second element that, in my opinion, explains the success of the comunitaria is that the comunitaria acts within the law. So the right to autonomy of the indigenous peoples allows them to assume security and justice within the rule of law. Unlike armed self-defense groups that are not accountable to anyone and act on their own logic, the comunitaria acts under the democratic control of the Coordinadora Regional and responds to the communities. The third point has to do with legitimacy, power, and the hegemonic order. If the comunitaria has been able to impose itself, it is because it has been recognized as legitimate first by the communities and later by the state. Its legitimacy, however, is not based on an a prioristic ground. It is based on some form of successful power. The comunitaria has not, these are the concluding remarks. I had to skip some of the paragraphs I have here. The comunitaria has not only learned how to move within the margins of the state, but for the last 23 years has greatly contributed to the empowerment of indigenous people in the state of Guerrero, despite facing numerous obstacles, two of which have been state repression and internal divisions, and even though economic conditions have barely improved. This experience might not travel well worldwide. Nevertheless, it points to possible alternative futures worth reflecting upon. Thank you very much.
I would wish we would have now about 4 more hours to form like several little circles, you know, in a more horizontal way and engage with those fantastic speakers. There's so much food for thought, but I was informed that we really have to actually finish on time at 3:20. But I would suggest maybe you can form small circles and mingle. Outside, there's a huge space in those hallways and continue this fantastic discussion. Let's give a warm thank you applause to our speakers. Thank you all for coming.